I noticed that in true style, there is nobody in the front.
It's like church.
Everybody's in the, yeah, so that's okay. I'll just project out this way. So the title that I had for today was College Writing and Speaking, Where in the World Are We? And I'm going to add to that, Decentering Ourselves in the Work of Writing. Because I think I'm going to focus a lot on sort of the notion of center and decenter and recenter as a way of thinking about where we are in the world. So because of that amazing introduction, what I was going to say in the beginning, I'm going to shorten down a little bit. I was just going to talk about sort of how I got to where I am in terms of cross-cultural work as a starting point. So I'll still give you some of that because it'll complement what Linda just explained. So I am bilingual, which is important for what I'm going to talk about. I am a dual citizen of France and the United States, and that's made some things a little easier to do. I did do my PhD in France in linguistics, and what I want to emphasize there is that the French linguistics tradition is sort of markedly different from the linguistics tradition in a lot of other places. It's certainly different from United States linguistics traditions because there are many in the United States. It's a very particular focus on function and functionality. Language in use, sort of dynamic language in use. It's not to be confused with systemic functional linguistics, which is quite different, in spite of the fact that it also focuses on function. So that's just a tag to keep in mind. And the other thing I wanted to point out that's unique about the French situation, you mentioned it quickly that I belong to a research lab there. When you do research in France, nobody works independently. Nobody is sort of a scholar out there on their own. You always belong to a research lab. It's the scientific model. It's actually true, I think, for a lot of people in the United States who are in the hard sciences. So I belong to this research group there, and it's a wonderful thing. There are about 45 people in the group. The name of the research group is Théodile, which is Théorie et Didactique de la Lecture-Écriture, which is theory and teaching of writing and reading. And people from all different disciplines who are focused on that particular topic get together. Once a month, couple of people from the group present their work in progress, people critique it, people talk about it. There's a very real sense of community that I think is hard to find a lot of times in the States when we're more sort of fragmented and spread around, and we don't necessarily have that sort of steady, regular, once we get out of graduate school, we don't have that steady, regular community that we have before then. So that's an important piece to know about in terms of the kind of work that I do and how it works. This will be a pretty informal talk about where I've been and about where I'm headed, and I'm hoping that it will lead to, I should talk for about 30-35 minutes. I'm hoping that that'll leave us a good half hour for just lots of questions and dialogue, and you can take that dialogue or questioning in any direction you want. I mean, I'm going to sort of throw out two main aims, but there might be some small thing I say somewhere along the line that you really want to focus on. That's fine. I don't mind at all. I'm going to be talking mostly about a project I'm working on right now. It's a book project. It's based on a book that was published already in France in 2008, which was a book-length description of the cross-cultural study of student writing that I did between France and the United States. And I realized as I started to work on the book project that actually I wouldn't just be able to translate it. I would need to massively redo it because it's got to fit into an entirely different understanding of writing in higher education and what it is and how it comes about. And at the same time, the sort of whole field of the whole translingual model of understanding language and the way language works in higher education was becoming more and more sort of present in people's conversations. And I've realized recently that there's the potential for a real synergy between what I had done in that cross-cultural study and the translingual agenda. What I haven't quite figured out yet, and that's what I'm going to ask for your help on today, is how to articulate what I sense is a really strong connection, and I think I've started to articulate it, and I actually figured out a little bit more of it this afternoon while I was getting ready to talk to you. But I haven't quite put my finger on it, so maybe that's one of the things that we'll be able to talk about after I'm done. So we'll see. I will make a few big sweeping claims that maybe will be controversial, I don't know. I'll tell a couple of stories, and I will ground some of my comments in the results of that particular study. The study is described at least partly in the written communication article, and I know that a lot of you probably read that for today. So I will try not to overlap with that article too much, but there are people here who haven't necessarily read it, so I'm going to try to, I'll talk about some of it without going into too much detail in order to just get at that. So. After having recently attended the Watson conference, which actually focused on some of these questions, I have to say, too, that I'm a lot less sure than I was a month ago about some of what I have to say. So just to let you know, there was a lot of questioning that happened at that conference that has made me really think about things. I can say for sure a few things, though. One is that My own center of interest is not so much with some of the centers of interest that actually were expressed at the Watson Conference and elsewhere. It's not so much having to do with rights to language. It's not so much having to do with support of multilinguality. I think there are plenty of strong voices who are developing those avenues. What I'm trying to look at instead is what it is that I think we lose, what the loss is for ourselves and for our students if we keep ourselves in a monolingual world. Monolingualism, I think, has the potential to be, in the 21st century, a real loss. And when I say monolingualism, I don't just mean in terms of the language itself. I think I mean it in terms of a state of mind, right? I mean the sort of sense of monolingualism as a world frame. In order to get at this, I'll try to talk to you coming from a French perspective, but of course obviously embedded in United States perspectives as well, because I teach and work in the United States, about centers, about decentering and miscentering and recentering our work on university writing in the context of the world, in the context of where we are. Two main aims specifically, and this will split sort of half and half in what I talk about afterwards. The first main aim, to offer some perspectives from outside of Anglophone composition studies into some of the questions being raised by translingual and globalized scholars about university student writing and teaching. And second main aim, to discuss a cross-cultural situated reading method that offers nuanced analyses of student writing from two countries, grounding the composition field's broader translingual and global questions in this particular concrete example. So I'll talk first about one and then about the other. I really do see these as tightly interrelated, and I think that's partly what I'm grappling with, is how are those two aims interrelated, and how might we make sense out of them. So starting with the first main aim, just a brief framing first of globalization in general as linked to composition. I think the claim is very often made that composition studies will become an anachronism without attention to the digital. That's become a very accepted statement. I think that composition studies will also become an anachronism without attention to the global and to everything that it means for writing research and for teaching, for programmatic development. There are plenty of calls to address global contexts, both as they exist within our classrooms and as they exist beyond. Those have been loud and clear. I think what's been a lot less clear is how exactly we should be doing that. How is it that we can teach composing and communicating in the world as a grounded, real response to the popular and maybe even to the euphemistic labels of, say, citizens of the world, for example. You hear that a lot, or just globalization as a general term. One really well-developed response has been to study how students from diverse linguistic and cultural contexts in the United States are working across languages and rhetorics, moving us away from the assumption that teaching writing in higher education is teaching in English. Matsuda, Hall, Horner, for example, have all worked on that. Moving us away from the assumption that achieving fluency in standard edited English is the best fluency to have. Minzan Liu, for example, has really focused on that. Scholars like Venuti, Kanagaraja, Horner are suggesting that translinguality actually is the new norm, and that linguistic, rhetorical, conventional, and cultural ideological negotiation is a given. In this model, fostering dispositions for negotiation is the center. Transmission of codified linguistic entities, English or otherwise, get pushed to the margins. The model supports all languages as always in translation within and across themselves. Pennycook, for example, argues that. Now, he happens to target mostly English, but I think that the argument he makes is an argument that's just as valid for French, for Frenches, for any other kind of language. Rather than as sets of discrete operations speaking to each other, a view espoused by earlier understandings of language as sort of discrete units, and multilinguality as simply operating across these discrete languages. That is, imagining them as sort of coexisting monolingualisms, right? So we've got all these bodies of monolingual, and they're just communicating with each other. That model is the model that's really called into question, that sort of idea of these discrete entities. In favor of maybe seeing languages as sets of semiotic relationships, for example. The translingual lens asks us to see and to place both ourselves and our work very differently, to decenter our monolingual practices and assumptions in a world context, and to consider languages as those fluid sets of semiotic relationships rather than as discrete entities that you are fluent in sort of one or the other of. However, and this is where I think there might be a point of entry for some of what I'm trying to do, even translingual scholars appear so far to have focused largely on issues of multiple Englishes. of English as lingua franca, of students operating within and across multiple languages in Anglophone contexts, and of multilinguality as English plus other. The question of English has had to be that necessary starting point, so this isn't a criticism at all. I mean, we had to start with English. That's where we are. It's where we're working. Scholars have been working to unseat our assumptions about English in U.S. composition, so I think it was the right starting point. But I think there's now the possibility for another angle, for a different informative set of concerns in terms of the complicated nature of students writing in contexts in which the starting point is another language, subject to the same deep questioning about translinguality, but within different political and ideological frames dominating writing instruction in that context. These are, I think, equally our concerns as we open ourselves up, as we revise ourselves, as we think about who we are as global citizens of writing studies, a writing studies that is not necessarily in English. Calling on other cross-cultural research traditions can be a real, concrete, and sustained force in helping us to do that, and to understand what it is that we'll lose if we don't do that. So with that in mind, just a few comments in practice about what it might actually mean to do that kind of decentering. Information about writing instruction and about research in other countries is, I think, vitally important to what we're doing in the United States, but it's often not accessible, except in articles focused on contrastive rhetorical analysis. And those have been very important, but also, I think, oversimplified renderings of writing in the world. And when I say oversimplified, I don't really mean that to be a criticism either. There again, it's a very necessary step in terms of what it is that we've done and worked on. But it has led to that same sort of mindset of language as a discrete, closed world where you can compare what's happening for a particular kind of writing and what's happening for a particular kind of writing in another country, and you can look at those in very sort of concrete ways and say those are stable features that we now have identified that go with, you know, country X, Y, and Z and language X, Y, and Z. It actually leads to queries like one I saw recently on the Writing Program Administrators listserv, which probably a lot of you saw as well, where somebody wrote and said, so how do they teach students, you know, what is writing like in, I forget what country it was that the person named, but it was that kind of a question, that kind of a, so what are the features of that country? And I've encountered the opposite when I've worked overseas and people have come to me and said, you can imagine yourself trying to answer this question, people come to me and say, so how do they teach students how to write in the United States? You know, and I say, well, okay, which college, which, you know, theoretical frame, which, you know, right, I mean, what kind of, yeah, so it's not a question that you can answer, right? And I think it's not a question you can answer in the other direction either, but we don't always remember that. You know, we'll sort of look for the global understanding of what we're doing. John Trimber suggested at the Watson conference, the recent one, that United States college composition is a particular project that evolved in a particular time, in a particular frame. You know, making a sort of a clear claim for that. I think that's true. I also heard arguments from conference speakers at the Watson that given the fact that it started as this project, our field needs to remain composition rather than writing studies, and that we are actually teachers of writing, not of language. And there I'm not so sure that I agree. I wonder whether that's simply another way to imagine ourselves as at the center, right? If it's about composition, we must own it. And that's kind of complex even in itself. I mean, if you think about the word composition, we poached the word composition, right? So musicians in the world can tell us that composition was something they owned far before we did. So I suggest we might decenter as well, you know, that kind of term, maybe even our terminology generally, fragment and multiply meanings as a way to open up the dialogue. I think there's great usefulness practically in exploring false friends across different kinds of international research context, or studying how terms are at the center of a field sense of its work, again as a sort of a practical way into trying to understand some of the global implications. When we start from a point other than English, we grapple with questions like the ones raised at the Watson Conference and elsewhere about the tension between teaching language and teaching writing. This particular question seems in some ways to come out of the trouble, I think, with ESL being perceived as teaching language. And so for a long time it was sort of pushed to the margins as other to composition. Obviously that's not true anymore, but there's sort of a history to that I think comes partly from that question of teaching writing, teaching language. Certainly not only, I think it's much more complex than that, but it's an interesting question. We might draw from French discussions about teaching where in fact meaning construction through writing is considered meaning construction through language. and writing teachers are considered language teachers. We might also draw from modern language research and theory, which I've learned recently has a great deal in common with composition studies that many of us don't necessarily know or think about. We can also look at actual practices. In France, contrary to the broad proclamations that we hear about how everybody everywhere is now speaking in English, teaching writing in French is not going anywhere. Not in the elementary school, not in the high school, not in the college, not even in graduate work in most cases. It's a very different sort of a domain and understanding, and the way language is being worked with is not what we may hear in sort of these broad statements about English taking over the world. U.S. teaching of college writing is not the center in that case against which all others are compared. U.S. research about college writing is not the center either. Professionally, I know that the international field of writing studies has fostered writing centers, writing courses, publications and conferences, drawing on research about writing in higher education, how it works, how it develops, how it's best taught and learned, how it's situated across all levels in a variety of cultural and institutional contexts, sometimes focused on students learning academic English, sometimes, but largely focused on writing by students using the language in the country where they are as they enter and move through higher education. And again, most of the time we don't have access to that because it's being written in languages that we may not necessarily know or be willing to enter into or try out or understand. Finally, we can study production of scholarship in non-Anglophone countries as a site for deep questioning. In France, for example, monolingualism in scholarship and in some forms of graduate education, not very many, but in a few pockets, is actually being forced into a certain kind of bilingualism. This is not the case of monolinguals who are choosing not to be bilingual, other French language politics aside, because their first language appears to be spreading around the world, but rather people being required to be a certain kind of bilingual in order to do work that is more and more being valued in their country as the only way to succeed, or at least the only way to succeed academically. And that's a really important distinction. I mean, the whole question about whether perfection in language use is actually success or is necessary for success, it's not a question we're going to talk about today, but it's a good one to ask, right? I mean, the issue of language perfection and the kinds of success we're talking about, that is a question obviously posed by the translingual scholars. So, and it is on the horizon of the kinds of things that we're talking about. So that's the sort of first aim, the general discussion about Anglophone composition studies and the kinds of things that we might be able to think about, or the kinds of practices or the kinds of research that we might want to be more familiar with. That I think is useful for rethinking the way that we approach things. It's one way to sort of decenter ourselves. Let me talk now, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about another way into this decentering through analysis, through close reading of student work in other cultural contexts. I think that this might provide a different way to understand the issues that I raised in the first section, including the nature, actually, of translinguality. I think it might, and that's one of the things that I'm working on. I'll talk a bit about a particular cross-cultural study that I carried out. The study is, I'm not going to talk about it in too much detail because it is in both the written communication article, in some, not all of it, but some parts of it are, and also in the handout that I gave you. And there are copies of the handout over here if anybody else needs them. But I did excerpt some parts of it in there as well, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. But I do think that the study has two essential roles that are relevant to the conversation today. The first is its results, which suggest that we have a lot to learn about students' work in their texts across cultural contexts in ways that maybe we haven't learned before. And the second role I think it has is its methods, which suggests the need for drawing on other rich research methods and traditions outside of the ones that we're most familiar with. It turns out that students' texts, at least in this particular analysis of 250 texts across France and the United States, reveal a transfer of social knowledge and a development of general discursive strategies used to negotiate new settings and new knowledge, far more than an acquisition or demonstration of specific features of kinds of writing that differentiate them culturally. In other words, basically they share more than they don't. This suggests that many-layered complexity is at work in what they do and also in the way that we understand what they do. This also decenters by suggesting that our sense of reified difference, developed largely in work that uses English as the anchor, might be, if not outdated, at least ready to be moved beyond or ready to be added to and developed. The analysis involved a preliminary quantitative approach tracking linguistic features in students' texts, including modalities of person, forms of sentence construction, isotopes of meaning, and deixis. That quantitative analysis oriented a qualitative reading of the text in order to understand why the identified features that surfaced for readers, why they surfaced as they did, and what other kinds of textual movements might be at work. Exploring the text reprise modification, that's a term that comes from French functional linguistics that targets the ways in which each text actually used available language and meaning to create a new text. So it's just it's a unit of analysis, a reprise modification. It can be something as small as a word or as large as an entire passage. And that particular term helps us to understand other aspects like subject positioning, like complex coherence devices, intertextualities, forms of originality, other things like that. The initial questions that I had when I started this kind of work years back were actually very comparative. I mean, when I began the study, I was actually trying to understand what's different between French and United States student writing. How does it work? Any comparative work that you take on like that faces the I think often insufficiently addressed problem of genres and text types. If we accept a fairly traditional version of genre, then contrast can really only be established if you can get such a tight control on two comparable objects that really share multiple situational and contextual factors. And that limits obviously what you can look at, because you have to get such closely defined situations that you close down what you're able to look at. If, on the other hand, we take genre in its more complex social activity forms, then among other things, the questions of different assignments that are being given to the students, different subjects that the students are writing about, different readings offered to the students before they actually do the writing, quickly actually become much more telling than the differences in writing itself, or at least equally important in terms of making sense out of text construction. In my first round of results, for example, I noticed that one of the most important influences on what the students produced, on their tone, on their style, on the organization of their essays, was actually the text that the student had read in preparation for doing the assignment. So that particular piece was more influential than almost anything else. You could actually trace the echoes and the reusings from what the student had read right into the writing. And that was true in France and in the United States. I actually think, if anybody's looking for a project, that there are studies just waiting to be done on that particular topic. So if you're looking for a project, it would be a good one. A little bit more about the study itself. Although, again, what really matters here is not actually this study per se. It's the value of the close attention to student work across cultures and how that might contribute to our understanding of translingual approaches to writing that I'm trying to get at. The study itself is just a way to get there. So the data sets were from first-year courses at 4 French and 2 United States universities, as well as 3 French and 4 United States final years of high school. And I'd be happy to talk afterwards if anyone's interested in why I brought in the high school part. It was actually necessary, but I can talk about that. The types of writing prompts were matched as closely as I could get them to be matched. They did all involve using a source or sources. So it was always about something a student had read and had responded to. The analysis called on several research traditions and sets of literature, including Bakhtinian analysis, discourse analysis, generous reading, and French functional and enunciative linguistics analysis. And you can actually take a look on the handout at the first page, front and back, if you want to see a more detailed description of each of the different categories of analysis that were used. So that gives you a little bit of a sense. I think that these other traditions are actually part, to me, of what's so important in terms of the value of reaching beyond what we know now, because they offer us a different way of looking at student work that we get from those other approaches. Within the study, empirical quantitative methodology and qualitative methodology were sort of in dialogue with each other as we went through the analysis. Within that broader framing, let me just talk for a minute about 3 particular points that surfaced for me out of the actual analysis. The first was that reprise modification, this analytic tool, is, I think, a really powerful lens for understanding student work as an intersection between the individual, what an individual student produces, and the sort of common shared pool out of which the student is pulling things, the sort of generic field that the student pulls from. which enables a different understanding of textual coherence and intertextuality across cultural contexts. Second point that surfaced for me is that deep reflection excuse me, on students' text construction and negotiation suggests that being a first-year student doing work on a given topic in a given genre might actually trump cultural context. So that's the second possible thing to think and talk about. And the third is that I think new cross-cultural methodologies are necessary in order to get at that. These are all, to me, very insightful in terms of the translingual agenda. But again, I haven't quite been able to articulate why I think they're so important. I think that they are. I think that they contribute. And I'll make some attempts to show why I think they contribute. But globally, they suggest, and this is maybe one of those points of connection, that sophisticated linguistic and rhetorical attributes that I found in the student writing with this kind of analysis are some of the same attributes that the translingual scholars talk about when they talk about students who are working across multiple discourses. So fluidity, hybridity, particular kinds of agency, an ongoing negotiation of meanings and frames. These are things that scholars like Horner, Liu, Royster, and Trimber have recently highlighted in scholarship about how translingual texts do the work that they do. Student writers in both cultural groups in my study adapted forms of accuracy and appropriateness, but they also pushed back against them with very similar strategies, testing the limits of university writing conventions, whether in English or in French, and integrating themselves in very real ways into the work that they were doing. It's really difficult to capture when you try to, I'm going to talk to you a little bit, or we can talk about it during the discussion, some of the examples that I put in the handout. It's really hard to capture even in a fairly long example the overall complex picture of this discourse that I'm trying to get across. I have tried to offer the examples, but features are really moving targets in this kind of, so you can take one really small feature like a particular deictic that's doing 5 or 6 different things at 5 or 6 different levels in the work that the student's work that you're looking at. And if you're not able to give a long extended example that shows all the ways that it's doing the work that it's doing, it's harder to get across. I'm still going to try, but it's harder to get across exactly what it's doing. So take, for example, a deictic, which is a very small, powerful unit. It can be linked to creating coherence overall. It can also situate subject positions. It can index the genre. Another example is commonplaces, which are usually fairly finite, half of a sentence kinds of things, or maybe a full sentence kinds of things. They are subjectivities, but they're subjectivities in different ways than, say, first-person pronouns are. So, you might be looking at one text and it might be doing all of those things, and unless you're bringing all of them back together to understand what the text is doing, it's just hard to express exactly what it's only by exposing all of the interlayered factors that you actually start to understand how that particular text is sort of a reuse of, an appropriation of, a negotiation with everything that's available for the text to do the work that it's doing. And it's that sort of deeper understanding that I think brings us to understanding how texts across cultural settings are doing what they're doing. If you do take a minute to just look at the handout, I'm actually hoping that the handout can serve more for discussion than for me going through it. So I just want to point you to what's in it so that you know what's there, and then we can come back to it if you'd like. But it is some examples of some of the results of the work. And I don't know if we could, yeah, they're sitting right there. Thank you. So the first 2 pages I already pointed out to you are the actual deeper descriptions of the analytic categories. Then after that, on page 3, you should get a quick rendering of some of the actual contrastive part that came out. What were the sort of surface features with the quantitative work that came out as different? Page 4 describes some of the shared work across the 2 groups of students, what they tended to do in common. So it highlights some of those. And then pages 5, 6, and 7 are actually just samplings of some of the student work with some explanation of that work. So again, we can come back to these, but that's what's in there for you to be able to sort of take a look at and think about what some of those pieces might be. I'm going to shift over to making some very tentative conclusions, and then I'll just stop at that. There are quite a few tentative conclusions, so it's not just to warn you. But they're both tentative, and there are quite a few of them. So I think that the analysis does show that academic writing is a complicated and problematic notion, But I hope that the results lead us back to broader discussions that are relevant to 21st century globalized composition. So I'm hoping that that's the case. I think that our attention to studying students' work across sort of very traditional imagined cultural boundaries initially really entrenched us further into those boundaries. So a lot of the very good work that was done early on did create sort of stronger discrete silos of what language might be, what language might be and how it might work in students' writing. The new methods and the new frames that are in operation today open us up to the shared and incredibly complex movements and negotiations that students are carrying out in different cultural contexts in spite of what appear to be those initial surface differences. Kanagaraja's model of negotiating works really well here. I think this is from his Rhetoric of Shuttling Between Languages article, where he talks about writers as agents shuttling creatively between and among discourses. And one of the things that this is what I understood this afternoon as I was working on this that I hadn't understood before. One of the things that I realized I might be up against is, I'm looking at somebody like Kanagaraja and he's talking about these writers as agents shuttling creatively between and among discourses, and I'm thinking, but all the students in my sample were either French writers or United States writers. So actually they were in these very monolingual situations, right? So how is it? And I thought about that for a while and I realized that I think where I see the connection is that that's exactly the point, is that they were in these two discrete contexts, in French and United States context, and yet they were in fact using very similar strategies and rhetorical movements to get themselves integrated into and to negotiate with the context that they were entering into. So in spite of the fact, one of the points that Kanagaraja and others with him makes is that the language is not this discrete sort of entity, that we're just imagining that they're kind of these very discrete, that they're in fact much more fluid than that. And that's where I think the connection is, that these students are actually doing the same thing. So we can come back to that, but that's a part that I'm intrigued by and that I'm hoping to understand better. I think that it's an avenue that's fruitful to pursue. I think it might offer concrete grounding. I think a lot of the work so far in talking about translinguality and talking about globalized, a lot of it has been very abstract. And so one of the things that I'm hoping is that we can find more concrete examples that let us really work through it, and this might be one of the ways to do that. I've mentioned this already, but I think it's worth saying again that the assignment prompts were particularly telling, and that I actually think that there might be more to be said if you want to do cross-cultural comparison by looking at the assignment prompts than by looking at the student work. It might actually be more useful to look at what students are being asked to read and what kinds of questions are being asked of them in order to better understand cross-cultural comparison. So there's another project, anyone who's looking for one, not me. I have enough. So the us-them model of globalization or cross-cultural contrast can and should, I hope, dissolve as we take up these new kinds of questions about teaching and research and assessment. It can hybridize theory in both contexts, in contexts across cultural situations, and it can offer a new understanding, I think, about first-year writing as well, about what it is that we're doing in first-year writing in those cultural and disciplinary frames. It also should be able to open up dialogue about writing outside of the United States, deconstructing some pretty powerful myths about the absence of attention to higher education writing outside of our borders. One caveat about the kind of analysis that I've presented in the second half of what I'm talking about is that, it is entirely focused on analyzing texts, and that's, of course, a limited approach. We don't know all kinds of social and personal variables that are in play with any of the students that I studied in that particular setting, right? So textual approaches, if you look at them in a certain way, they kind of fly in the face of accepted wisdom, especially in terms of the always already socially constructed nature of student work that the field takes as a given at this point. So I think that I understand that, and I'm very aware of the existence of that, but I also think that we've left out, because of that, we've actually left out close attention to student text for a long period of time. Certainly not everybody. There are people doing wonderful work, close analysis of student text, but the field as a whole, it is not a sort of a major trajectory for people to be doing a lot of very close analysis of a lot of student writing currently, or a lot of student text. So I'm hoping that that's a kind of analysis that will offer a way into the features of texts themselves as insight into how they're doing and they're redoing their work. How what the French call the mise en mots, the actual putting into words of something carried out, can offer ground for being read. And that actually brings me to another major question that I have that's kind of on my mind, which is shifting our attention to the reading relationship rather than to conclusions about the actual text as object itself. And again, there are people who have done this kind of work. I'm suggesting that this is a way to further develop the work that we've begun there. In terms of cross-cultural questioning. So people have done this kind of work, but not in terms of cross-cultural questioning, much more focused on what's happening within the United States. So the kinds of questions that it raises for me is, what is actually reading student work in a cross-cultural context? Is it a movement between the text and the reader? Is it a Bakhtinian responsive understanding in which the relationship itself is what the movement is? In particular, what is my reading of student work? How does the reading over many different texts create my ground that I'm operating out of? What is my particular cross-cultural position? And how can I invite others into that particular cross-cultural position? The culture obviously comes out of the reading, as do the relationships between the quantitative measures and the interpretive analysis. So how does that create something that makes sense to me, and then how does that create something that can make sense to other people? And a second major area that comes out of that is, what is good method? Every reading is a reformulation. The quantitative and the qualitative can interact if we allow them to. The quantitative can be a point of departure. The identification of figures of meaning and textual movements opens a profound reorientation, I think, of our possibilities for entering into a student's texts across contexts. So that's something that I think pushes us outside of our sort of comfort zone. For how we tend to read things. And I think both United States composition theory and French didactique de l'écrit, which is the equivalent field in France, might change when we start looking more carefully at the text students produce in relation to these sort of textual contexts that they're working in across two cultural contexts. So really true conclusions. Last little part. I have come to realize, I think, that this study and its results are a living example of what negotiating language users do, the students as negotiating language users. Also of how simple cultural comparisons are not an adequate explanation and are certainly not the path to internationalizing composition studies. I think it suggests as well that we should be resisting fixed codes and discrete versions of languages with set features and acculturation models in all languages, not just in English. And a lot of the work that we've done on that in the United States is very effective for what people are thinking about in other contexts as well. It also suggests the complexity of it all. It isn't always about culture and nation, and it certainly isn't just about communication. I'd actually venture to say that a focus on communication is kind of a gentrification of the issue. We should focus on construction of meaning instead, and on the productive struggle described by authors Barnabé, Chamoiseau, and Glisson, and actually Catherine Prendergast does work in this area as well, in terms of the value of incomprehension, how incomprehension can actually usefully push us into some of these areas as well, when we start working across languages and confronting ourselves with that. And we're left with a few other questions as well. What will the centers of focus be in the future? If we stay married to our industry of first-year composition, which certainly many of you here are not staying married to, which is wonderful, as our field, then we indeed find ourselves uncentered, and that's a loss. If we maintain a focus on English only, that's also going to be true. If we don't broaden our research practices, that's also going to be true. Colleagues in other contexts are going to continue to say to us things like, where's the data? Which we're not always ready to answer, or there's only a social perspective here. What about all the rest? These are the questions that I hear from people overseas, and I think that's a loss. And finally, we might begin to entertain very concrete possible changes in practice, things like bi- or multilingual writing courses, which are beginning to be put into place. I know of two, at least in the United States already, where first-year writing is being taught as a bi- or trilingual course. Writing center work that starts to attend not only to the work of students who are writing in English, but to the work of students who are writing in courses in which they're being asked to write in French or Spanish or Italian or something else. Changes in our scholarly production, changes in our willingness very simply just to make mistakes when we speak in other languages, changes in our willingness to sort of try to negotiate and make sense out of other things. I think those are just some practical steps that make sense. All of them so that we don't face the loss of living and working and teaching and doing research in a monolingualist mindset that imagines itself as the center of the world of writing. That's where I find myself, and I look forward to talking about and taking up with you and clarifying any part of this with you, because I really am sort of in the middle of trying to make sense out of it, and I'm hoping that you'll be willing to make more sense out of it together with me. Thanks. And the handout is has a lot of pieces to it, so don't hesitate to use it or not use it as you see fit. Take your time, yeah.
Could you talk more about research labs, and maybe have you ever thought about trying to apply a similar approach in the U.S., right, or in your interactions with students or colleagues?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, the biggest complication there is that they're funded by the government in France. So that's actually kind of interesting, right? Because we'd have to, I mean, that's the way that rather than departments funding scholarship for faculty, the lab actually does things like sending them to conferences and things like that. So labs have 4-year contracts in France, and they have to actually reapply to the government every 4 years. And in the process of doing that, they submit a project. You know, they have to submit a report for the previous 4 years and then a project for the next 4 years. And then the government, you know, assigns them funding, which they then use for those 4 years to do all the different projects that they're doing. So there's a structural support for it that it would be hard to find, right, in the United States. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. I mean, it could be done on a different model. We could create it differently. I think it would be a great idea. My current project actually is to try to get my faculty in the Institute for Writing and Rhetoric, who are all adjunct faculty, just to do research as a way of sort of pseudo-creating one of those kinds of communities, right, where we're all sort of actively engaged in research projects that any one of us takes on. And I'm hoping that that's going to work. I think it will. But that's a much smaller scale version of that kind of thing. Yeah, I think it's a great idea. So, yeah.
I had 2 questions, and one was talking about this translingual lens and challenging a monolingualist mindset. You're using the examples of English and French, and I'm wondering if you would also consider like Hucker's discussion of outer circle Englishes. So, for example, Indian English, Singaporean English, etc.
Yep. Yep.
It sounds like a lot of the research you're talking about could be applied not even to languages that are so completely different. Well,
Yes. No. Yeah.
French, but also
Yeah.
looking at different
Yeah.
standard forms of English.
Yeah.
For example, at Purdue, we have a really large Indian population.
Yeah.
So what you're saying speaks to me, and you know, I'm thinking about those students who are here and how this examination of an Indian English would help inform our practices.
I think you're absolutely right. I think part of why I didn't talk as much about it is because there are people doing a lot of work in that area, and I'm trying to carve out a space where less work has been done. So that's why I use the example more of, say, France, and right, because very few people are talking about that kind of cross-cultural, and more people are talking about the world Englishes, multiple Englishes, global Englishes kind of issue. That said, I'm not sure, and I think that's a really good point, I'm not sure that many people are doing very close analysis of exactly what's happening in student texts in those cases, right? So that would be the opening there, would be to say, yeah, what's actually, if we really take a hard, close look at these multiple layers of work and all these different features and how they're all coming together, what does it actually tell us about how they're negotiating these various sorts of versions of English that they're working through? Yeah, yeah. And that would be a really nice, that would absolutely contribute to moving away from a sort of a monolingual mindset, right, in that sense that there's just this one, and that's all it's about. Yes, I think you're right.
And I was also wondering what your attitude was about the role of foreign language studies in a PhD program, for example, or, you know, are you talking to scholars who already have a second language or third or fourth language, or are you encouraging scholars that don't have another language to study another language? You know, it's like, is what you're talking about similar to choosing a specialization in writing program administration or new media or, you know, that sort of thing? Is this for everyone or is this not for everyone? Or?
That's a really good question. I'd never thought before about doing a specialization in, like you could be a specialist in international. That's a really interesting thought. I think I was thinking about it more as a way to encourage everybody. Maybe that's not very realistic, right? One of the other things that I've worked on with some other people, with a couple of other scholars, is taking a really hard look at what gets published and how it gets published, and the fact that nobody in the United States cites work from anywhere other than the United States. And that's not always even a language problem, right? Because we don't cite the Australians either, or sometimes we cite the UK, right? But so it's not always just a question of English, right? It's a question of all kinds of other factors that are at play there. But I think that two parts are involved in it. One is, I do think it's really important for PhD programs to be encouraging people to learn other languages, but to learn them in the way that the translingual agenda sort of encourages, which is not to learn them in order to be perfectly fluent in a language, but to learn them in order to open up the possibility of communication across, and to be very willing to do it roughly and to do it making mistakes and to know that you're going to encounter trouble with comprehension, but to do it anyway, right? To really be willing to push yourself to start to understand that you don't have to be perfect in the language in order to understand. Yeah. Yeah, for example, yeah. And actually, the more you're in something fairly discrete, like, say, discourse analysis, the more you can work across languages anyway, because you find fairly quickly a shared vocabulary, right, in terms of the approach that lets you build that part of your language ability much more quickly. So there are all kinds of really good reasons to just go for it. And I think that that's part of what I'm hoping to encourage people to do. I think. I don't know who to, go ahead.
I think a lot of what's going on in the conversation and a lot of what you're talking about is we're opening up borders and not being contained in our studies. And yet things like language, right, are beautiful things that are created by borders in a way. So how do we sort of transverse these borders and open up without being fearful that, you know, we're going to destroy some of the unique things that are created by borders?
Yeah.
How do we balance that?
That's a great question. I mean, there's always the danger in almost any. It's not just about the question of language. Anything interdisciplinary, for example, poses the same problem, right? You start working across disciplines because you see something really exciting in another field, and then you come to discover 2 years later that you sort of destroyed their notion of whatever it might be, right, that we've had a tendency to do. So sometimes. So that, you're right, that's a danger. And I think that actually in some ways links back to your question, because you can also choose to study the language for that reason, because you want to enter into sort of the beauty of that language as language. I don't want to say that it's just a question of communication, because I actually think the contrary is true, right? I mean, we can't just say, well, but as long as you can communicate, it doesn't really matter all the rest of it. That would be separating out the communication from the construction of meaning, and that would be counterproductive. So that doesn't work either. So that's a pretty tricky problem, right? I mean, on the one hand, you might really choose to study a language and study it really well and become a poet in it or become adept, and on the other hand, I wouldn't want that to get in the way of people being willing to partly learn a language so that they're able to enter into some of the other things that are going on. So that's tricky. You're right. You're right. Yeah.
One of my experiences with learning languages is that even harder than learning language is understanding the cultural context.
Yeah.
Within which the language functions.
Yeah.
And within which this writing is going to be working. So I like the idea of having people be fearless about, just learn a little bit of the language and go out there or whatever, do whatever you want. But what do we do about the culture? Because I think a lot is going to be misunderstood if we don't understand the culture.
And in particular, I think what people, I mean, I've witnessed this over and over and over again, and I know Linda will know what I'm talking about. that people kind of go to a conference, you know, overseas and hear a few terms and sort of say, oh, I get it, right? And discover 2 years later that actually they didn't get it at all because the word was the same, right? Or the term was actually the opposite in terms of entering into the discipline. You hear like social construction means something very different in France than it does in the United States. So you can kind of, you go into it and then you say, okay, no, that wasn't it at all. So that's not culture in the broader sense that you're talking about. It's more a question of culture in terms of the field, right? That's part of what I was getting at when I said I think it's really important for people to look at the terms they use and to unpack them with each other. I think that it's really difficult to enter into another context without the opportunity, if you don't have the opportunity to unpack the terminology and to understand the false friends and to understand the degree to which any given word has this kind of world behind it of one of the really frequent things that happens when you start working cross-culturally is that you realize that people are drawing from very different bodies of theory, very different. So, you know, you may be talking about the same thing, but the example I love to use, because people in the States think it's really funny, is that nobody in France would ever even conceive of using Foucault to talk about writing. You know, and I've always found that amazing because it was kind of so much of our field for so long. And people in France say, Foucault, why would you use Foucault to talk about writing? I don't get it. So, I mean, you would think that that would be a point of contact, and in fact, it's a point of block, right? It's until you understand why they wouldn't do that and why, in fact, they would use, you know, X or Y or Z instead. And that's part of that sort of broader cultural understanding. So, yeah. There's no easy answer to that either, other than trying to go into it knowing that that's likely to happen, trying to take that as a point of departure, trying to understand that any term is going to have those multiple fragmented meanings and that we've got to kind of get at them all. Yeah, it's hard work. It's definitely hard work. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious.
People who specialize in some other part of our field and who are sort of the voices of that particular part of the field for other people who are working in other areas in the field. That might be a way to help mitigate that possibility for just not having enough knowledge and kind of going into it. And one of the other things that I think would be really useful that would help with that, and this is not my idea, this actually comes out of work with a group of people, is to shift the requirements, the PhD requirements for language to make it that rather than people needing to pass a test in language, they actually should be involved in translation of abstracts of articles from other countries. And that work would actually go a long way if it were part of people's programs to helping people understand. It would really force you to work not only on the language, but actually on the entire context behind the language, because if you're going to do a good job of translating abstracts, you have to sort of understand the full argument behind it. And that would have the second benefit of having far more translated abstracts out there than there are now, which is a nice extra benefit, right? So, yeah. Yeah, it's a good...
I just think that probably is why so many people in, like, I'm thinking of like Eva Lamb,
Yep.
kind of sociolinguists who are focusing on visual communities,
Yeah.
where multiple languages come in contact,
Yeah.
and interact, and a lot of them in North America. And so I think that part of it maybe is not, because it's still part of North American culture.
Yeah, yeah. That's actually a good example in the other direction too, though, right? Because the number of fairly young people who just sort of dive in and communicate with people from all around the world about gaming, for example, creating particular games or the rules of the game or whatever, they do eventually get past. Now, maybe the stakes are a lot higher when you get into scholarly work and higher education. Maybe that's part of the problem, is that, you know, when you're sort of working in a game world and you're doing it because you really want to do it, your stakes are not the same, right, as when you're sort of crafting your career and trying to, so that might be another complication there to add even further to that. Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I just want to throw, I don't know, little historicization, I forgot to say, right? It's sort of, you know, we think of America as being English-speaking, but, you know, 100 years ago, it was a very multilingual place. There were a lot of publications in Polish.
Yeah.
New York was the center of Yiddish theater. Most people, when I moved out of Chicago and into the rural Midwest, was really the first time I'd get contact with the idea that
people only had one language. My parents had Polish, and then because they were Catholic, they had Latin. And even though I didn't have, my Latin was poor and I only had French, you know, my grandparents were much more literate in Polish, and they were much more literate in Latin as well. So and if you were Jewish, you were certainly literate in Yiddish and Hebrew, as well as perhaps Polish and English. And it's really within the past 50 years maybe that the English has become the dominant language in this culture. If you go back into reading in the late 19th, early 20th century, there's all this, you know, talk about the non-realization of the language, and how, like, these people don't speak English, and, you know, a lot of the same things we hear about Hispanic culture, just aimed at, you know, different cultures. But it was a very highly multilingual society. And it was really strange to come to a place, a part
And
of
have that
where,
shift.
where people, you know, had no history of other languages in their background. Not just did you have other languages, but they had no
history of it, at least in the recent, That actually, I mean, I think part of what the translingual agenda is about, if agenda is maybe not the right word, but the translingual perspective is about, is actually getting at that idea that, you know, we have students today who say, well, everyone in the world is now speaking English, so I'm going to be fine, right? I don't have to worry about it. And in fact, that's probably the person who's going to have the most trouble, because that person has none of the resources of the multilingual person, who is so much more ready to negotiate any situation coming in, right? And the person who says, oh, well, I'm all set, even in terms of other Englishes, right? I mean, regardless, that person's in trouble. So, yeah.
How much of this is pure ignorance, you know, that kind of perspective you described, versus active resistance?
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of people around me, and, you know, there's active, maybe it depends on the sort of layers of people. There's active resistance from, for example, administrators or administration, right? There's certainly active resistance there. There's a very settled, you know, standard edited written United States English is what we need, right? So there's that. But there's actually pretty entrenched sort of maybe non-examined acceptance of that, at least among a lot of the students I work with, where it's just sort of a, well, of course that's what we need. Of course that's what we need to know, and of course that's what makes sense. I'm not sure that it's active resistance on their part. I think it's more just, for the students in any case, it's more just a non-examined way of understanding things, right?
And thinking politically too. I mean,
Yeah.
when you're thinking about France and the U.S., you know, we're two countries that are dealing with an immigration problem, for example.
Yeah.
And backlashes against different groups coming in.
Yeah.
Perceived threat.
Yeah. And it's powerful.
You were saying, I was going to ask you, do you think it's just geographic, what you were describing, or is it also field specific or discipline specific? You know, I mean, what you're talking about, Pam, these geographical examples of, you know, looking at how we look at immigration, but I'm also thinking when you're discussing this, like, within our fields, within our different fields, I mean, because my MA is in TESOL, so I think TESOL is a lot more open to what you're describing.
Yep.
And, you know, I struggled a little bit when I transferred into Ret Comp, because I kept looking, like I was taking Bud's 591 class, and I was looking at everything through an L1 perspective, or an L2 or a second language writing perspective, and realized I have to start looking at this through an L1 perspective. So going along with what Linda and Tammy are saying, I was thinking that it's not just geographical, but also discipline specific.
Yeah, I think that's true. And actually, that layer, the layer of disciplinary, those two examples or any other examples of, I mean, linguistics is another discipline that might take a really different stance on it as well. But the disciplinary factors are, in everything I've seen, just as important as the cultural factors, right? So in both ways, right? I mean, you can actually have more connection across disciplines you can have people in the same discipline from a variety of cultures who might be much more successful at negotiating some of these issues because they've got the discipline in common, versus people who, so there's that, you know, that's a whole other layer of complicating factor. Yeah, yeah, definitely.
So you're thinking like if chemists got together, they would, the issues of communication
Yeah.
would be less
Yeah.
charged than when.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, from the academic domain, you can use those examples. You can also use them from sort of popular domains like graffiti writers, right, who get together around the world and have no language problems, right? Because I mean, I know a lot of them, and they work just fine, and they negotiate, they manage, right? They walk into it assuming they're going to need to negotiate, which is, to me, the whole difference. So, what were you?
I was just kind of curious about if you think that, like, in a way, sometimes I feel like college is too late. Not that it's really too late, like, partially that's like utter laziness and fear, like, as we were talking about at lunch, like the fear of approaching other languages and other
Yeah.
cultures, and sort of, you know, that I see myself as an ambassador for, and then I'm going to be like a jerk when I go and try to speak another language. Or which is the opposite. For not trying to speak a language, I'm more of a jerk. But in a way,
We're stuck no matter what.
I think in a lot
That's
of
not
ways,
good.
like, our whole educational system has not valued this kind of cross-cultural exchange. In fact,
That's true.
actively not valued it.
Yeah.
Paid lip service maybe, but you know, students aren't tested, it's not given weight throughout their whole undergraduate education. You know, my biology students are not told be prepared to speak to Japanese biologists.
That's
when
right.
You get, you know, because you're going to be hired by international companies.
Yeah.
They should maybe, but it seems like this is maybe something that should be addressed in an educational, like in a broad educational way as well, in order to sort of, because it's good, I think. Because I agree, and I think it's really neat. I know, I'm crazy language.
Good policy.
But I mean, in a way, I feel like our field should be actively, and
Yeah.
I'm thinking about specializations,
Yeah.
or like, why aren't there more international rhetoricians as like a subfield within our field?
Yeah, yeah.
That's not really a good question.
I think part of, well, no, it is. I think part of the issue there too is back to this notion again of sort of fluency and perfection, right? And that is what you get graded on, among other things. You get graded on fluency and perfection. You don't get graded on your negotiating abilities, right? You get graded on, did you produce this in grade school and in high school? Did you produce this accurately in the way that you were supposed to produce it? So it works against that in a very real way. Yeah, yeah.
But it's also, we don't promote, I mean, if you're really going to learn a language, you really have to start early. You know, people are most receptive.
That's also true,
to
yeah.
learning a language in grade school. I mean, I started French in third grade, and while I can't speak it anymore, I can still kind of grope my way through it. But if you have to start it until college, you never quite, you know, it's, I mean, it's hard.
It's hard.
It's harder.
Yeah.
It's harder. Your
It's hard.
brain is more,
It's hard.
more used to thinking in more sophisticated ways in
Yeah.
English than it is when you're 8. And so, and on the other hand, we devalue other languages that people
Yeah.
have, so that, you know, students are punished for speaking Spanish in school and
Yeah.
all of that.
Well,
All of
you
that.
don't,
So
you don't even have to go to, you know, K through 12. I mean, one of my frustrations, Erin and I are the, I don't mean to drag him into this, but we're the representatives right now for introductory composition at Purdue, and 2 semesters ago, I had a lot of the instructors who are, you know, PhD students in ESL who teach 106I, which is an international student option for first-year composition, and these instructors were really upset because at the beginning of the semester they'd have all these international students come to them crying, begging to get into their sections because 106 instructors were telling them, oh, your English isn't good enough, you need to take 106I. And so ghettoizing or marginalizing
Yeah.
international students. And I don't blame those instructors completely because, you know, if you haven't been given the tools or the resources to work with international students, and if you have maybe one or two in a class of 20, you know, those instructors struggle with how to help those international students in the best way. So I wonder how much, I guess I'm just proselytizing now, but I would like to see, you know, I would like to see there be more crossover, for example, with disciplines like ESL and RetComp. I think there needs to be more overlap there and more formal instruction of both disciplines in the other disciplines, you know.
I think you're absolutely right, and I actually think that there's also room for more crossover with modern languages. I was serious when I said earlier that I learned really recently the degree to which we talk about the same things, and I had no idea that we talked about the same things. I went to a conference this summer in French linguistics in New Orleans in July, which I don't recommend. that was not my choice, but that, you know, I went to these sessions and I'm listening to people talk. I could have been at a conference. I was listening to people talk about the things we talk about, but they were talking about them in terms of teaching French. And it was just really intriguing to me to realize that we had this whole domain of colleagues that were, you know, and they're usually right down the hall from us, and we're not, you know, we're not understanding that better either. And I wonder too how much of it, I mean, you think about all of we do have colleagues who are bilingual, right? How many colleagues do we have who are bilingual who publish in more than English, right? Why don't they? I mean, why don't they publish in, you know, if they're bilingual German, English, why aren't they publishing every once in a while in German, right? Why not? Yeah.
As a multilingual person,
yeah.
I don't know that it counts for tenure. A lot of times I don't know that it's tenure.
There you go. I mean, that's what I was trying to get at, is that you know, we're in a really difficult situation where at no point is it being encouraged. It certainly is not being encouraged in terms of the kinds of things that get validated, right? So.
I think maybe we'll go for one more question or comment. All right, we can
Don't have a fight.
I don't want to go last, so you can get to go last.
Oh, okay.
Because I was observing this conversation and thinking about, I mean, it's discouraging at some level, but really encouraging because of how I think you opened up your talk, Professor Donahue, which is composition won't survive unless we pay attention to the digital. And everyone in the room kind of goes, yep. And then you go, composition won't survive unless we pay attention to cross-cultural, multilingual ideas. I mean, my shoulders got heavy when you said that. Oh my God, I don't want that to be true.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about what must the conversation look like 15 years ago, maybe a little longer, when somebody said we have to pay attention to digital.
Yeah, that's right.
We have to start young.
That's right.
That would come up. You know, it doesn't count for 10 years.
That's a really good observation.
I think it's encouraging at the same time.
Yeah.
Even though
Yeah.
I don't know I want to use. Maybe I'm too old already.
I guess mine is also an observation in that I was thinking of the relationship between this last discussion and your comment earlier about the fact that for those students, the uniting or the common factor that may have been stronger was the fact that they were students producing for academic context.
Yeah.
Than actually what was going on in that negotiation. And I think, as you've pointed out, and maybe you would speak to this more, but that negotiation of the being a student is what they were doing, not negotiating with the language.
That's
perhaps.
right. Yeah.
So I think, which resonates with your sense of what's going on in the field and academically.
Yeah. It was to me at the time, it was the most surprising thing. I mean, now I take it more as normal because it's been a long time that I've been working on it. But at first, I really was surprised that the degree to which they were doing these similar things that at a really powerful level, you know, and it just kind of changed the way I thought about how students across different cultures might be working. However, and this was pointed out to me maybe a few months ago, and I think it's a really good thing that I need to think about a lot more. The two contexts I was looking at were France and the United States, and those are, in a lot of ways, not that different. So, you know, I'm not trying to make huge sweeping generalizations and claims about the fact that that's something that I think is true in every cultural context. I don't know. I think we need to find out. I think we need far more of that kind of really deep study across different contexts. And we might find something very different if it's something less similar than, you know, with all that they share sort of culturally, historically, politically, you know, there's a lot in common between those two countries. So that's my final warning.
Before I say final thank you, next Thursday, of course, is Thanksgiving. Our final meeting will be the week after that, and that will be when the people from Visual and Performing Arts are coming to give the presentation. They were canceled last week.
That sounds great.
So anyway, your response.
That sounds really good.
Will be in 2 weeks from today, so that you can concentrate on food.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you, thank you.